So without any further delay, allow me to introduce Dean Nancy Stewart. Nancy.
Thank you so much, Bob. And I want to welcome our students, our alumni, our faculty, our staff, our board members, our friends, and the greater arts community to this first Auerbach lecture of the season. This is the second year we've been streaming them, and I have to say, if there's anything good about a pandemic, it's that we have learned to stream these important lectures to a larger audience, and also be able to bring artists from further afield. And today's artist, Stephen Lee Young, is from Montana, and he'll be introduced shortly. Before that, I want to introduce my friend and colleague, Professor Matt Towers of the Ceramics Department. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Bob. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. The Auerbach Visiting Artist Lecture Series began in November 2001 and is made possible by a gift from the Beatrice Fox Auerbach Foundation Fund of the Hartford Art School Endowment, Inc. The gift enables the Hartford Art School to bring visiting artists to campus each year for 1 or 2 days. And during that time, the artist delivers a public lecture and spends time in the studios critiquing student work. I, along with my colleague Stephanie Lanter, would like to thank HAS Inc. for making this lecture series possible. The Ceramics Department is proud to present Stephen Young Lee as the first lecturer in the series this fall. As stated in his bio, Steve has been the resident artist director of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts in Helena, Montana since 2006. In 2004 and 2005, he lectured and taught at numerous universities throughout China as part of a 1-year cultural educational exchange in Jingdezhen, Shanghai, and Beijing. In 2005 through 2006, he was a visiting professor at Emily Carr Institute of Art and Design in Vancouver. Steve has lectured extensively in North America and Asia. In March 2013, he participated on a panel, Americans in the Porcelain City, at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. In 2013, he was one of several international artists invited to participate in New Blue and White, an exhibition at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston that featured contemporary artists working in the blue and white tradition of ceramic production. In the fall of 2016, his work was featured as a part of the Renwick Invitational at the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. He is represented by the Duane Reade Gallery, Farron Contemporary, and the Archie Bray Foundation Gallery. His work has been collected by the Smithsonian Museum, the Daum Museum of Contemporary Art, the Four Seasons Hotel in Seoul, Korea, as well as many private collections. And his vase with a dragon from 2020 has just recently been acquired by Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art. Steve received his BFA and MFA in ceramics from Alfred University. Originally from Chicago, he lives in Helena, Montana with his wife, Lisa, and their son and daughter, Gavin and Florence. I know that we're all excited to hear more details about his work and stellar career. So with no further ado, I'd like to welcome Stephen Young Lee.
Thanks, Matt. Well, it's great to be here. I appreciate everybody signing on. This is a really nice crowd that we've got here. And thanks to University of Hartford and Hartford Art School, and Matt and Stephanie for inviting me to be part of this. Stephanie has spent a summer out at the Bray just about 4 years ago, and I don't know if she noticed it, but I've got one of her pieces up on my wall in the background here. And then Matt, I know, has spent some time out in Montana, but the way he and I met was I was an undergrad at Alfred University, and Matt was a grad student there, and he was one of the kind of like great mentors, I think, as a grad student that really helped a lot of us, who were trying to learn as undergrads. And I just had this vivid memory of him demonstrating in our wheel throwing class, and the way he moved the clay and the way he manipulated the material was just is always really fascinating and just like so beautiful to watch. So it's great to be able to participate in this program and share a little bit about the work I've done since that time. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And there we go. So let's see, I guess, for the presentation, I'm mostly just going to focus on a bit of progression in my work, and some of the different themes and projects that I've worked on. And hopefully share a little bit through that around the background and influences of how the work has evolved and developed over time. So I like to start by showing this pot. So this is a Korean Chosun dynasty jar that is from about the 18th century, and it's in the collection of the Ewha Women's National University, and I believe it's designated as a national treasure. And the reason I like to show it is because when I first started taking more formal ceramics classes in high school, so this is like my sophomore year, the teacher sort of presented a project where we had to find an image of the pot and then try to reproduce it. So at this time I was learning how to throw in the wheel, learning about decoration, using underglazes and that kind of thing. And what was so interesting to me is that I threw this little kind of crappy pot, and then I had these, commercial underglazes, and I was trying to draw these grapevine patterns. But the problem was that once I got to the edge of this two-dimensional image, I didn't know what was on the other side of it because I only had this image. So it was this moment for me where I was kind of using this method, I guess, or process of like trying to replicate an object and then getting to a point where I was having to like use the information at hand and then recreate it, in my own way, or finding my own kind of method to do that. So I was, had to like utilize that stylization of this image and then recreate that for the other side. And I think that this was really the beginning for me of like really this kind of obsession about historical objects and like looking at what these objects represented, what they could tell us about the time that they were created, what was happening in those cultures around the world. And then, here are these ceramic pieces that have endured like, hundreds of years of time, and we are now using them to kind of mine them for information about the context that they existed in. So that's become kind of a theme in my work, and it's something that I often do, and lean back on, is like thinking about, how our current situation sort of compares to like situations in the past and what we can learn from that. So now my practice really involves that as a core concept, where it's like reproducing historical elements in an effort to sort of reinterpret aesthetics and context within the work. So this is a piece called Birds of North America that I made in 2007. And for me too, it's very personal in a sense that, I'm really trying to understand and explore the identity of cultural influence through this material in ceramics, porcelain, or, just different elements of that, and trying to understand a little bit more about how that kind of comes together and coalesces in these objects. But to back up, so I mentioned I was an undergrad at Alfred in the late 90s. And, when I left school, I kind of began this career as a functional potter. And I was making work that, was primarily made out of porcelain. I was trying to make objects that really did function well and had a utilitarian kind of priority, in the work. And I guess aesthetically, a lot of what I was looking at were things related to, Asian culture, growing up as a Korean American in the United States. So, I would look at a lot of Korean Koryo ceramics and celadons, or Sung Dynasty, Japanese, like Japanese tea bowls, things like that. And, I focused a lot on like volume, simplicity of form, kind of thinking about the way that like the glazes, the depth of the glazes and how that would augment certain decisions made and proportions in the form. And I was really drawn to the accessibility and the intimacy of functional ware, and how people would interact with these objects and then use them in kind of different social interactions. But it was always interesting to me because, you know, it's this pursuit of perfection in a way. Like when you're making pots for consumption and use by the public, you know, there can be no flaws in this work, right? Like it has to sort of meet a specific standard. And, you know, just one flaw, like a crack at the handle or a crack in the base or, you know, pinhole can just completely devalue the object. And I always thought that was really interesting, where you'd have these beautiful things, and then if they didn't survive this whole process of, you know, the ceramic kind of science and technical, you know, path, that it would just like be worth nothing, and then you'd have to throw it into the shard pile. And, you know, I think a lot of that has to do with, you know, this kind of idea of like handmade pottery as it relates to industrial production and the same kind of standards that are being applied to that. So, you know, that was something I felt like it was always the struggle. You know, you're trying to make sure that these things can endure this whole process and then come out sort of flawless, or maybe, you know, beyond what your original expectations were. You know, I did a lot of art fairs at the time. So I was sitting out in a tent on a street somewhere and interacting with the public very directly. And I'd get a lot of questions about the work, you know, and what the kind of influences were or how certain decisions were made. And one of the questions that came up, or comments I'd say, is that people would say the work, you know, it's very Asian influences. And, you know, and I had to think a lot about that, because I would, you know, it seems like kind of innocuous comment, but like they kind of were. You know, I was looking at a lot of source material that was based in Asia, because there is such a long history of ceramic production in East Asian countries. And for whatever reason, those were the ones that appealed to me aesthetically. You know, so I was looking at a lot of the celadons and the proportion of, you know, certain periods of ceramics in different cultures. But it made me wonder a lot about, like, you know, the access that I have as someone who was born in the US with a Korean heritage. You know, does that give me kind of more or give me a different kind of ownership of that than someone else? Because there were plenty of other people who weren't Asian who were making work that was based on, you know, Asian aesthetics, you know, or Asian ceramic aesthetics. And, you know, I think it's something that I continue to kind of unpack in my work, and like where those boundaries are, and what, you know, what's accessible to who, and you know, how you sort of honor that in the most, you know, in a way that seems sort of worthwhile to the effort. You know, now I find myself in Montana, where I'm like one of the few Koreans, you know, that exist in this community, which is like another interesting perspective versus like where I grew up in Chicago, where I was like one of many, you know, thousands of Korean people that lived in the area. This is an image of Bernard Leach, who some of you may have heard of. You know, Bernard Leach, for better or for worse, is probably one of the most influential potters or people in the field of ceramics, because of the kind of exposure I think that he brought to Korean ceramics, to Asian, you know, ceramics, Chinese, Japanese, etc. You know, but it was also very much filtered through this lens of somebody from England, you know, who was kind of like creating a hierarchy, I think, or a set of values around like what was good and what was bad. And, you know, I think it had a profound impact on the way that many of us have learned about ceramics. So if you go into, you know, most ceramic studios, there are celadons and tomokus and shinos and things like that that were really kind of handed down, you know, through the lens that I think Leach really established, you know, and then his many apprentices, or, you know, people who kind of followed his work, would then let that proliferate into our education system. And, you know, one reason I like to mention this is that, like, as Matt mentioned, I spent a year teaching up at Emily Carr up in Vancouver, Canada. And I was brought in as a visiting professor, you know, and here I am, a Korean American coming up to Canada, you know, teaching for a year. And a lot of the students that I had there were students from Asia, so Korea, China, Japan, and others. whose parents were sending them to the West to get this like Western education. And then I'm teaching them these like pottery techniques that were sort of handed down through the mind of an English person teaching me about Asian ceramics. And then I'm passing this information on to like Asians who are coming over to, North America to learn about. And the irony of it just kind of hit me one day where it's like it was just so strange, like the way that information kind of got handed off, and the interpretation of like how we were looking at these things, and how we were sort of understanding like what aesthetics were or technique, and I don't really have like a epiphany about that, but I think it's just this very like fascinating observation about just like my own experience within that structure. And I think it's so interesting too, because like Leach made a comment at one point where he said Americans have many roots but no taproot, which was inferring some sort of a disadvantage in terms of like what we bring to ceramics. And really the advantage in America in particular is that there is such a diversity in perspectives and backgrounds and cultural kind of experiences that it's such an advantage, I think, that we have, that you can kind of create this beautiful expression in so many different ways. After a number of years as making my living as a potter, I decided I wanted to go back to graduate school, and I ended up going back to Alfred University. And I decided that I wanted to kind of take a step away from making pottery, which is how I got in, but once I got there, I just thought, like my whole identity was sort of wrapped into this idea of being a potter, and making objects that were for use. And there's this whole kind of structure that exists for potters, or at least in my mind, about the role that you play as someone who makes those kinds of objects. And I wanted to just, not really like turn away from it, but kind of take a step aside from it. And it was very difficult because I'd spent so much of my life at that point, like thinking about what it meant to be a potter and what that, what that meant to the work and how the work developed. But once I did, it was really interesting, like just kind of exploring ideas that maybe didn't make sense in the context of like pottery, and thinking about like how you start to just make objects, that might be interpreted as sculpture or whatever, if you were to even define it, it's just making things. So I didn't really know where to start. So I'd never done that before. So I just started making these like giant blocks out of porcelain. This thing's probably like 3 feet tall and 4 feet wide or something like that. And I would just coil build these big porcelain blocks, thinking about the kind of the most basic form you could imagine. And then of course, instinct kicks in, and I just started decorating them like they were pots, so that I was doing these inlaid, stamped decorative surfaces on them and inlaying them with cobalt. And what I found really, what was really like, I think helped me a lot understanding this was that like I made this thing out of porcelain, and I'd been using porcelain to make these other objects, and I'd sort of figured out like how to do that and get it through this whole process of ceramics. But then now I'm kind of shifting like what the object was going to be. So I was making these very thick blocks of porcelain. And of course, once you fire them, they start to shrink, as porcelain does, and it starts to crack, and it starts to do all these things that, I didn't want it to do, because in my mind, I thought it would just be this perfect porcelain block. But it was really the material kind of revealing itself, like the true character of what these materials do, in reality, is that they do shrink, and they move and they warp and they do all that kind of stuff. So my time in grad school is really about like experimenting with that and sort of understanding what the material was going to do naturally, and then trying to divorce that from a sense of expectation of what I wanted it to do, and kind of rebuilding like a process that that embraced the nature of what the materials could do. I got very focused on certain pattern motifs and symbolism, as and one of the images, as you can see from the previous slide, was this quatrefoil image. So I don't know exactly why, but I felt like this was just a way for me to bridge this idea of like dealing with surface and imagery on a surface, so pattern is an easy way to just kind of to wade into that. So the quatrefoil to me was interesting because it's this very simple motif that shows up in a variety of different cultures around the world. Like you could look at it as sort of a representation of a clover or of a flower. But if you look on the top left, that's a detail from a Gothic cathedral, and that brings its own kind of history of symbolisms or meaning, where it's like the apostles, or it's the 4 cardinal points, or it's like things that are being applied to that. And then on the right, you also see it as this architectural element in a Zen Buddhist monastery in Japan. And then on the bottom, it's also included as an element in, Muslim architecture, in a mosque. I believe that's from Morocco. So, that I thought was like so fascinating, is like how these images and how pattern can kind of translate across cultures, across geography, how meaning kind of gets applied depending on the environment that they exist in. Also in graduate school, I started thinking a lot more about blue and white, just as like a period or a genre of work, that and its development and impact internationally. Growing up, we would go to Chinese restaurants and we would see all this kind of stuff, and it would be in my house. But to me, I always just saw it as like this, almost like a color, like a very sort of blurred kind of aesthetic, but once I started to really research more about like how the images were developed, or how the different styles of painting, or how they were influenced based on where they were made, it really revealed a lot more depth in terms of like how these objects then became carriers of information, and how they sort of informed people from around the world through trade, what was happening in other parts of the world, really. So, these are a couple of Chinese Ming Dynasty porcelains. I also was really like taken by the idea of how, the way cultures sort of embraced the materials that were available to them based on geography. So, you have these beautiful porcelains that are being created out of Asia, and they're traveling around the world through, the Silk Road and other methods. And then you have folks who are like, well, we don't have porcelain where we live, so we need to figure out a different way to do that. Like we have earthenware clay. So we're going to take earthenware clay, we're going to cover it with a white glaze, and we're going to paint it like the porcelain using cobalt. And then in that kind of process, they're creating a whole new genre of work. So, on the top, you have tin glazed earthenware from, the Delftware, and in the bottom, Italian Derudaware, which these are both low temperature clays. They're covered in a white glaze, and then the imagery is being applied, but then the imagery is also influenced by what's happening in that part of the world, and I think it's such a beautiful thing that like these objects can become ways that people are translating information, and they're also spreading that information elsewhere. And then you have weird stuff like this, like we're on the left, it's English Bow Factory. You have this kind of example of chinoiserie, which is like English painters trying to imagine what it is like in China, but then painting these like super white looking Chinese figures, like going through a landscape. And then on the right, I have no idea what the hell that is. It's like, it's from Meissen, but it's like Salvador Dali Buddha or something, just this bizarre output of like what can happen when you have people who are trying to understand something about other cultures, but maybe have never experienced it in person. So one of the things that I did as kind of a formal exercise was I started throwing these, what I consider to be kind of like iconic shapes or archetypal forms of ceramics, and mostly from like Asian kind of influence. And I was throwing them solid, and then I would take a hammer and I'd sort of break them apart and use those pieces and these fragments as maquettes to create larger sculptures. So here's an example. I would just build these out of porcelain and try to mimic some of the shapes and curves that were happening in those solid pottery forms. And then I'd refine the surface, and I'd apply imagery on the surface using a Korean inlay technique called sangam, or some people refer to it as mishima, which doesn't make sense, but I'm not going to go on that rant right now because it doesn't relate to each other in any way, but I just call it inlay. And then I'd fire these objects, and then they would crack and they'd warp, and I just kind of keep moving them forward on a timeline. So I was trying to like remove a sense of expectation and what the objects would become. And I would just kind of keep looking at them, opening the kiln, looking at them with the information that was there, and then reacting to that. So here, I'm filling in these big cracks with like kiln cement, and then I put it back in the kiln. Sometimes I'd flip them. But it became this like really interesting exercise for me of just like, the only end point was that I had to have an exhibition at the end of my master's, degree or graduate time. So this was the exhibition, my MFA exhibition at Alfred. And this is where all the objects kind of like ended up on that timeline. So this is a piece called Here Nor There. And again, I was really looking at like how you like kind of finding ways to play with like simulation of like fragmentation, and the timeline of like ceramics and the geology, and basically like encapsulating like something that maybe, or trying to simulate, geology over long periods of time into a very compressed time period. So I was using inlaid motifs and then overlaying commercial glazed decals on top of that. This was a piece called Flight. So there's a little figure kind of running along a ragged, the rock edge here. This piece was called Circum. And then this piece was called Elegy, which was the last piece I made and started to incorporate more of this Chinese landscape imagery. So there's like a pine tree here, and then these commercial decals of birds flying through here. After I finished grad school, I had an opportunity to go to China on a cultural exchange fellowship. This was literally the view outside of the window of the studio I worked in just outside of Jingdezhen. And for those of you who don't know Jingdezhen, it is, they call it the porcelain capital of the world, where porcelain was originally discovered over 1,000 years ago. And the whole town and area is really built around this idea of, or built around ceramic production. So the Ming Dynasty vases, that I showed earlier were very likely produced in a factory in this town. And they call it rural, but it's like over 1 million people, but beautiful rice paddies and farmers. And but then you also see stuff like this is just photos walking down the street in the market, and I just loved how embedded this material was into the daily lives of, all the people that live there, like either through production, sales, napping, whatever it might be. This was an image I took at the antique market, which is just a series of blankets and a dirt lot. And here are all these shards that were literally being dug out of the sides of hills where they were cutting new roads. So if they had to put in a new road, they're unearthing like these old shard piles from back when the factories were in full swing. So you'd find pieces that were, 100 or 200 years old, just here on this blanket. It was also really like kind of mind-blowing, honestly. Like, here I had just gotten a master's degree in ceramics, and then they were doing stuff with this material that just did not seem possible. And it didn't seem like I just didn't think it was, I'd been trained about this, and it's like, you can't do that with porcelain. It's like, well, here they're doing it. So this is the large pot factory, and they're making these pots that are like 15 to 20 feet tall. And for scale, if you look down on the bottom left of the right image, there's a motorcycle next to one of those pots. So there was also this like incredible familiarity with the material to figure out like what the limits were of it, and how to embrace the material to create these things that you just wouldn't think are feasible. Another thing that I love this image. This is a shot I took when I was in Shanghai. I was just walking down the street and I saw this and I just thought it was like such a beautiful way, like beautiful image of like how I felt when I was there, thinking about cultural perception and assimilation. So, like kind of what's natural, what fits, what doesn't fit, and as a Korean American going to China, I had a very different experience in the way that I think in my interactions than I did, let's say, with like white Americans, or particularly Americans with like red hair. Like people would just didn't know what to do with it. So, so that was this ongoing thing. It's like I was kind of like trying to understand that in myself, and like thinking about like my experiences back in the United States as a Korean American, and then going to China and like people treating me very differently, because I sort of blended in. And one of the things that was pretty profound for me, even though it seems sort of silly, is that one of the questions you get asked a lot when you're in China, as you do here, is what's your sign? And here we're referring to a certain zodiac. There they're referring to, the Chinese zodiac. So I grew up going to Chinese restaurants with my family. My sisters and I would look up, oh, I'm a rabbit, I'm a dog, I'm a this. And for my whole life, I've been fed this, right? Like, luckiest of all signs, talented, articulate, affectionate, yet shy. You seek peace throughout your life. Marry a sheep or boar. Your opposite is the cock. Okay, that's good to know, right? It gives you some sort of guidance in life. And, rabbits are this like very, furry, cute thing. And it has a very specific identity, I think, that it sort of establishes. And one of the things I found out is that, partway through the year, I realized that my birthday falls January 30th, falls right on that line of Chinese New Year, which moves because it's based on the lunar calendar. So about halfway through my time in China, I found out that I wasn't a rabbit, that I was actually a tiger. And I was born in 1974 in that particular year. So my birthday fell on the previous year. So this was like mind-blowing to me, because my whole life I thought I was a rabbit. My mom said I was a rabbit. Everybody, that's just sort of how my identity started being formed as a kid. And then suddenly I'm a tiger and I have to like contend with that, right? And, tigers are aggressive, courageous, candid, sensitive. Look to the horse and dog for happiness. Beware of the monkey. Like I hadn't been looking out for the monkey, but there it is, right? So, and it seems silly, but like it really like affected me, because I couldn't believe how like one thing could shift like that. And then suddenly it's like I'm looking at my whole upbringing very differently, right? And I think that a lot of times what happens is like we use these systems such as the zodiac and your astrological sign to kind of create a way to relate to other people, or to help sort of categorize like where we are and who we're dealing with. I think religion can play the same role, politics can play the same role, and I think that has always been an ongoing interest of mine, is like looking at those systems and how they enable us to make sense of the world that we exist in, or make it a little bit less scary at times. But then also trying to be very aware of like where these things might falter or fall short. So when I was in China, I started to make this body of work that was like, I guess, maybe the process of like transforming away from that identity. So I started to make these rabbit sculptures. The one on the left is a giant bust that's probably 3 feet tall, solid. And I'd never really sculpted in this way, like making a large positive and then, shaving it down or sculpting it down, which is more of an academic kind of approach. And in China, the art schools are very academically, it's very much academic training. So they're learning about proportion and anatomy and things like that. So I wanted to create these objects kind of based in that same vein. And then they kind of move through the system of the factory. So here you've got this giant rabbit head sitting next to Buddha, you know, in between the Guanyin figures, Goddess of Mercy. But I love that, like it was just flowing through the factory system. And then at the end of my time there, I was given an opportunity to install the work that I'd been making in a factory. A friend had let me kind of use his factory. And I was working with a lot of different craftsmen. So I was making these objects, and then I would, you know, then bring it to the mold maker, who would make a mold, and then I'd bring that to the presser, and they would press the work. And I'd never really worked that way. It's like in ceramics in America, it's like you don't really delegate things as much. Like you're usually like carrying the process through from the beginning to end, you know, making the clay, then throwing the pots, then trimming the pots. Whereas in China, it's like everything was very segmented in this system. So that became a very different but like important thing for me to see, is just like how you become more of a conductor in terms of the fabrication of the work. So here we have, for the opening, one of the things that was really wonderful is I was able to invite all of the craftspeople who had helped me along the way to this kind of art opening, you know, where we were playing jazz and had a keg of beer and we were, you know, hanging out. And they hadn't seen this from start to finish. So they were seeing this for the first time. And, you know, it was really just a wonderful experience to be able to share that with them. So this is a piece called Instinct and Consequence, where I was kind of playing around with symbolism. And this is all made out of ceramic. There was like a ceramic table maker who I designed this pagoda structure, and he was able to make that. So you can see some details. This piece was called Fortune's Fortune. They're all holding a bouquet of flowers, 13 flowers with the black rose in the back. And then this was a series I kind of called the Identity Series. So, you know, I'd made a bust, kind of a blank bust of my own head, which I'd never done that before. It's not very good, you know, but then I'd use that as a way to adopt these different identities based on imagery I'd been seeing. So this piece is called Me as Buddha. This one is me as Leslie Chung from Farewell, My Concubine. And this is one called As a Good Soldier. And then this was the last piece I made. So that was that large rabbit head. And then I had some carvers come, and they carved all this imagery on, or these decorative flowers and things onto the surface. The other, you know, after coming back from China, like, you know, I was thinking more about like the kind of work that I'd be making in my studio. And one of the other bodies of work historically that I've always really been very fascinated by are these Joseon jars, porcelain jars from Korea. And, you know, they're just so, like, I think they're just such beautiful objects. And there's kind of a freedom to the way that people in Joseon times were painting, you know, where it wasn't quite as tight, I think, as some of the, like, the Ming Dynasty work or like what was happening in Japan. And, you know, it was indicative of the time and the sort of political and philosophical thought that existed in Korea. It's like a Neo-Confucianist Neo-Confucianist structure that existed in Korea at the time, which was a little bit less rigid. There was freedom to it, and at the same time, kind of an austerity to the objects. I've also, you know, been looking, you know, also been really interested in I mentioned this sangam or inlay, which is a specific process introduced by Koreans into ceramics, which is using carving tools to create like little to carve into the surface of the clay and then filling that in with colored clays. So that's how they're creating this imagery. It has a very different sensibility to it. So, you know, I made a series of pieces that kind of related to this. So here's a jar that I made called Granary Jar, which is incorporates all of these cereal mascots from my youth, you know, that had kind of an enduring legacy. So there's the Trix Rabbit, Quisp, Tony the Tiger, Honeybee. This is a piece called Prehistoric Jar, because I just was really interested in this idea of like dinosaurs actually still roaming through the same landscapes that like Asian painters were painting. This piece called Jar with Clouds and Bald Eagles. Thinking about, kind of imagery that has certain significance within perhaps American culture. And I mentioned, this is a white, just a pure white version of a Korean Chosun vessel. And I would see these, like I had some time to spend in Korea. I was there for about 3 months and I was taking a lot of photos of these jars. They also have them at the Met and different museums in North America. But what I loved about them is that there are these jars that were made, the assumption is that they're made in 2 parts. So the base is this kind of cone. The top is like a hemisphere that's sort of plopped on top of the base. But then because of maybe the softness of the clay or the weight of the top part, like it ripples the form so that there's this, it's sort of non-symmetrical, but that the Korean potters at the time were able to allow themselves to accept that because it's not perfect, it's not a perfectly symmetrical form, but it's still a vessel, and it's still a vessel that has approximately the same volume, as the next vessel, but then it also has its own kind of character and individuality. And I thought that was such a beautiful thing that there was that license to be able to allow that to happen, based on what was happening in Korea at that time. There's a quote that I really like by Joseph Campbell from The Power of Myth that says, "Perfection is inhuman. Humans are not perfect, but what evokes our love is the imperfection of a human being." And he kind of speaks to the perfect human or the perfect God as being like uninteresting. It's boring to worship a perfect God. You can be in awe of it, but it's not something that you can relate to or really love truly. So that kind of led to me making these deconstructed vessels, which were, it's a bit of a like revisiting of the work that I was making in graduate school, where I was taking these vessels, which had a very specific identity as an object, as a decorative object, but then, what happens if you let the material just kind of like do its thing and they start to explode, or if you crack them and let them warp, and then I found that they just reveal a whole new set of characteristics that maybe I would never have allowed myself to get to because I was trying to make the perfect thing, So these pieces are really at the core of a lot of my work now, because it's just this constant like journey of exploration and surprise and elation, of what happens when you let ceramic materials just like naturally occur and do things that you don't think are going to happen. So, I'm trying to like eliminate this idea of failure or expectation in the work, and it becomes more responsive to the conditions, and what is revealed through the vessels kind of evolving, I guess, through the kiln. So there's more, expectations kind of replaced by improvisation and reaction, and I think any parent, in the audience can sort of relate to that. It's like you have an idea of how things should go, and then something else happens, and it's usually much more memorable and interesting, because your kids do crazy shit and you just have no idea how that's going to play out. Sometimes I set up the work so that the decoration is interacting with the form. So in this piece, which uses a Minoan octopus motif, it's sort of tearing away at the vessel. And then, here's a piece where you have these cranes kind of flying out from this opening in the object. And I've been told that like my work can evoke kind of a negative emotional response, but I sort of think that it's tied into this idea of expecting the vessel to be perfect and expecting the vessel to be a vessel and what we're familiar with, but then when you have this thing open up and start to really change, it's still beautiful, it's just presenting itself in a very different way. So it's a little bit about like recalibrating the way that we look at, things that we're familiar with. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about our process. So, oftentimes when I visit a lot of museums, I read through a lot of books, I like to collect these different motifs and just do like real simple drawings of them that I then kind of cut and paste onto the surface of the work. Sometimes I'll use them in functional objects, and then as far as making the pots themselves, so I do I think I work similarly to maybe how the Korean potters back in the Joseon Dynasty did. I often throw these pots in sections and then reassemble them and refine the profile. These are 2 halves of a moon jar, and then what it looks like after assembly. And then that's typically when I'll kind of puncture the surface of the piece. So the timing has to be very specific. If it's too late, then it just cracks differently. And I still am kind of playing with that too, but traditionally this is where that will happen. And often I'm working on multiple pieces at a time in the studio. And then before that, I usually do the decoration. So when the clay is still leather hard or has a bit of a softness to it, I'm using a knife to carve all the drawing into the surface. And part of the reason I like using this inlay process is because it's very linear and more graphic, which to me is important. Like, I'm not trying to present the work as painterly. Like, I just want it to be a representation of an image. Or at times I use this, it's kind of like you might hear a bit like a sgraffito technique, but it's basically covering the pot with the slip and then carving through the slip to create a distinction between values of white. And then here are a couple pieces in process in the studio. And then once they go in the kiln, I glaze them, and then I have to put sand down on the kiln shells so that when they fall over, they don't stick to anything. These are not that fallen out. Like, some of them are much more catastrophic looking. And then after this, I have to do a lot of cold work to kind of polish and remove the sand texture. So at times, things happen way beyond what I expect, and at this point, I try not to expect anything, but just having made enough of these, like I have an image will form, but then I'll open the kiln and something completely different has happened. So this was one that like completely fell over, which ended up being so beautiful. Like this is the image from the poster, but like the way that like the porcelain is bending and like how it shows tension and volume in the work. This was a piece called Moon Jars with Dragon, which has this dragon kind of moving into one opening and then out of another. I've also really been like, I just love working with glaze and letting glaze just kind of run, which is something that all ceramic artists are always fighting, is gravity, but then I kept thinking like, well, what happens if you just let the stuff run? It's beautiful. Like, look at how beautiful the surface and the depth of that is. And, so still kind of like deprogramming a little bit of like, what we're trained to do. This piece, faced with lotus pattern. Here are a couple of platters, and then on the right, I'm using like a kintsugi repair, which is like filling the crack with gold as a way to recognize its value and uniqueness. And then again, like coming back to this idea of like reorienting the form and playing with, what's sort of the kind of standard expectation of these, is expected here. That was a basin that I fired on its side. Moon jar with spaceships. So at times too, I like to just, play with like different kind of like a certain goofiness in terms of symbolism and motifs. Here I was making some pots that were based on kaiju figures from Japan, and the reason was that a lot of, growing up as an Asian American, like there weren't a lot of things that we felt proud of, or things that we were entering into the mainstream that were things that we could kind of associate ourselves with. But Godzilla, when Godzilla movies came on, it was like, this is so cool, and it's like happening in Japan, you know, and other white kids are watching this stuff, you know. So this is Godzilla with Mount Fuji. And then this is a base with Mothra. And I've also, you know, I started to work on these pots too with more of a monochromatic glaze that emulate historical glaze palettes. So this is a yellow base with gold butterflies coming out on the inside, base with dragon handles and red glaze. And the reason why my titles are so boring is like I'm kind of patterning them off of what you might find in a museum. So it's just like a categorization of a new object. This is Maping glazes with yellow glaze. And then I just wanted to share a couple of projects that I've worked on for exhibitions, you know, over the past few years. So this was a piece called Red, Blue, and White that I made for a solo show at Greenwich House Pottery in New York City. And I make a lot of cups just in my own studio production, but you know, I was thinking about ways that you can start to bring together, like, or at least for me, this history of being a potter into a realm of like, you know, installation or like a sculptural object. And this was a piece I made where I wanted to make like these 3 panels of colors that kind of became a representation of just like they're different genres of work in terms of like red and white, blue and white, you know, but then also having it appear almost like a color field painting. So each panel had 100 cups with different decorative decorations on them. And, you know, it was quite a process. I had to kind of revisit the days of being in China where I had to hire people to come in and like help me with the production of these objects. So this is the red panel. And you can see each cup is decorated very differently than the next, like no 2 were the same. Here's a detail. And then blue and white, the blue panel. And then this is the white panel, which was that white on white that I was working with. Better there. So that piece now is at the Daum Museum in Sedalia, Missouri. More recently, you know, I've always just been interested in ceramic production, and one of the things that I kind of dove into was plates. You know, like handmade plates in a pottery studio, like a 1-person pottery studio, is like a nightmare. You know, they're just so hard to make. They're super inefficient. You trim away like a ton of it. But industrially, a lot of these plates were made using a jigger jolly, which is this machine that kind of helps spin blanks that you could then trim or decorate. So the way that works is you cut the profile. This is the profile of the foot into metal, wood, or fiber, plexiglass. And then you have to set up this arm, you know, and I was trying to learn about all this stuff, but there's not much out there in the world that, you know, for like studio potters, it's really more industrial. So, you know, you have to get this arm that you can attach this blade to and then create a form on the wheel that has the interior profile. So here you could see there's plaster mold that has the inside of the plate, and then you put the clay down and this blade sort of cuts the profile of that plate. And there in a day, you can crank out like 10, 20, 100, you know, of these plates, depending on how many molds you have. So I would take those plates and then I would trim them. And then, you know, they're essentially as handmade as any other object, you know, that you would throw in the studio. So I had this show at the Portland Art Museum, and, you know, they really gave me a lot of access to the collection. And they had these beautiful pieces, including this Minhwa painting from the Joseon Dynasty, which is, they had these itinerant Korean painters during the new year would go and paint these images for good luck to families into the new year. And one style was this tiger and magpie, which you could see these examples of these paintings in many museums around the world. But it's called Kachi Horangi, and the tiger apparently depicts like the aristocracy or the yangban, And then the magpie represents the common people. So there's often this like relationship between the tiger and the magpie, and the tiger usually looks really dumb and the magpie is kind of more serious and sophisticated. So I wanted to make a piece that sort of related to this particular painting that they have in their collection. And, you know, I was thinking a bit about like my own history, and, you know, I grew up eating Frosted Flakes like every morning. And Tony the Tiger was this like image that was in my life. He was this character. And I just, you know, I thought it was so fascinating because it's like, obviously like our sense of nutrition and what we feed our kids is like changed very dramatically. And here's this tiger that was sold as like this picture of health, you know, and athleticism. And then I also grew up watching these like Heckle and Jekyll cartoons. And I loved the magpies as these figures that were always kind of like, you know, messing around with people and causing trouble. And then here in Montana, we have magpies, and like everybody, first time I saw a magpie, I thought it was the most beautiful bird I'd ever seen. But then people here hate them because they're really loud and annoying. So I thought that was like, you know, just the way that people can interpret these images. So this is kind of the process that, you know, I was thinking about, like how to like replace some of the people in that. And then I wanted to make this like much larger scale piece that would involve this like kind of overlay of that image onto these plates. So it was like 9 by 12, I think. And then, you know, getting into the scale, it's like something I had to like lean on people who have certain technical skills that could help me like plan this out, you know. So I was working with one of my coworkers, Amy, on this, and then creating these templates and then making the plates and then transferring the imagery onto the plates. And this piece was eventually too big to fit in my studio, so I had to work on it in sections and then hope it would all line up in the end. And then I had to make like tools, new tools, just so I didn't destroy my neck looking down at a plate as I was decorating it. Just a little easel I made. And then all of these were inlaid, so I was using a knife to transfer that image onto the piece. And then unfortunately, the only way I could build value was by stippling, which is a terrible choice because I had to stipple like hundreds of thousands of these stupid dots onto these pots to make a black. So I just wanted to show this video to show you how hard that was. But here, you know, see some of the pieces in progress. The tree, which was very difficult just because once you blew up that image to the size, it was hard to distinguish where the pine needles were versus the trunk. This is Jake, who's currently an MFA up at Alfred. He helped me with a lot of the production of this work, doing some of the inlay. And then starting to get some of the pieces out of the firing slowly. This was Tony. And then the other challenge was like, how do you install this thing in a way that like isn't going to be impossible? So what was nice about designing the plate myself was that I could also design the plate for installation. So each foot ring had a little groove kind of trimmed into it. They had to all be exactly the same width. It's like 190 millimeters or something like that, so that they could then be hung onto a screw head on the wall. So that was what it looked like in the test. And then the only time I ever got to see this piece in its entirety before the installation was on the kiln room floor at the Bray. And that was it. I just sort of had to hope that everything worked out. So this is the install at the Portland Art Museum. You know, and there was a specific measurement of where all the screws would go. And the team there was great. Like they were just fabulous to work with. So anyway, you get an idea of that. And then this is the final piece. A couple other pieces made in that exhibition. This was a Joseon jar that they let me handle. You know, it was really heavy and just wonderful to be able to interact with it directly. And then here's a piece I made sort of in response to that, which is more of like Puff the Magic Dragon as opposed to a traditional Korean dragon. And then this piece I'd made a few years earlier, but this is one of the larger jars that I'd made. And by increasing the scale of the object, it shifted everything that happened in the way that material changed. So this piece cracked much more than normal. And then again, it's like I kept resigning myself to this idea that I would just keep moving it forward, regardless of how I expected it to turn out. So once I fired it, this was it in the glaze firing, and that was it after the glaze firing. But it eventually turned into this. So I took all these pieces and I kind of recomposed them, and then figured out a way to have it hang on the wall. So when you see it, it's like this mass of like twisted parts that are all fused together. But you get these little bits of information based on where the decoration is visible or not. Okay, I'm going to start moving a little quickly here. So then this is a moon jar by a Korean artist named Kim Yi-kyung in the Portland Art Museum collection. So I made a piece to respond to that. And during the time of this exhibition was the time of a rare blood moon. So I made this piece that was kind of riffing on that. And I really tried to reproduce her original jar as accurately as possible, but then using this very deep red glaze to signify that time that it was created. A more recent project, so I had a show at the Duane Reade Gallery in 2018. And I'd always wanted to make a piece that was honoring Bruce Lee, who is this figure that a lot of times I think becomes kind of sensationalized or becomes campy, a little cartoonish, but really for so many young Asian Americans, like Bruce Lee was a very important figure in terms of someone who represented something beyond the kind of traditional Asian stereotypes, and and represented a certain amount of pride, I think, for a lot of us. And but I didn't want to make a piece that was like too, like, just too light. So I created this piece that was more of like a tribute, I think, to him, and not about martial arts necessarily, but just like a portrait of him around this, I guess it'd be like a plate with the dragon decoration on the outside. So this was that piece in progress in the studio. So all the outside imagery was done with inlay, and then the image itself, I used a commercial decal printer that had to be printed in thirds and then kind of matched up. That part actually took longer than anything. But this was the final piece. And this piece is now part of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor Museum. And there are a few pieces more recently, I think I was responding a bit more to like kind of what's happening in the world, and just thinking about the way that, there's so much just kind of unrest and politically, racially, socially. And so this piece was called Asian Yellow Baluster Vases, vase with red, white, or stars and stripes. And this was another kind of riff on the Tony the Tiger. Last thing I just wanted to share is that, this has been such a crazy year, as we've mentioned. And, once the pandemic hit, it's like all of us were at home, and I was kind of losing my mind because I wasn't really working in the studio very much. So I ended up setting up a little makeshift studio in the basement, mostly to do projects with the kids. So I bought a little test kiln, and we were making these tiles, and just, a way to kind of stay sane, and I'm sure many of us had to find ways to adjust and cope to that. But it also kind of led me down this path where I started to make work that was based more in this like Buncheong tradition, which is around the same time, it was during the same period of the Joseon Dynasty in Korea, but instead of these very beautiful austere porcelains, it was this kind of loose, dark stonewares with slipped, very like kind of emphatically applied, and then like drawings that just didn't have the same kind of tightness to them, very expressive. So I was making these pots, and I was just kind of throwing slip on them, and then letting just I think letting there be a certain freedom to like how I was able to draw on the surface or the kinds of pots that I was making down there. And it was a really wonderful thing. I think it was something that I wouldn't have done if it weren't during the pandemic. But it kind of gave me a very different experience and led me down this path that was important for me. I think, as an artist, just thinking about like all the things that were happening in the world. So just real simple drawings, nothing too crazy. But I love that freedom and the kind of permission to just make something different, that maybe wasn't representing the work that I've been making up until this point. So much looser or sillier, here's Godzilla attacking a city. Angry Tony the Tiger. Sometimes it was just based on like how I was feeling at the moment. It's like I grew up my whole life dressed as a ninja, and then suddenly we had to dress up as ninjas again. This is a little Batman cup. I always thought Batman should have been an Asian superhero. Didn't make sense. And then the last two images, this is the piece that Matt referred to. So this piece was one that just got acquired by the Crystal Bridges Museum of Art, which I'm really excited about. And it was part of an exhibition called Crafting America, curated by Glenn Adamson and Jen Padgett. And then this piece here was titled Korean American Artifact, that was part of the Objects USA 2020. That was a revisiting of the 1969 exhibition at the Museum of Craft in New York. So that's it. Thank you so much, everybody. Sorry if it went a little long, but I appreciate everyone sticking it out, and thank you for having me here. It's just wonderful to be able to share the work with all of you.
Thank you, Stephen. That was fantastic. And I believe now Stephanie is going to manage questions out of the Q&A. So if you haven't entered any questions and you have questions that you'd like to ask Stephen, please enter them in the Q&A, and Stephanie will ask them for you. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Okay, so the first question is from Wendy Staples, and she's asking who your professors were at Alfred. Seems like she graduated in 2009, and she says her professors were the ones who really built her artistic foundation, and she still remembers what they taught me. So do you have any comments about your professor from Alfred?
Sure. Well, I should say that like I started college at the University of Iowa because my parents, I didn't even know what it meant to be a ceramic artist. I went to school as a business major because that's kind of what seemed the responsible thing to do. But at Iowa, I met Bunny McBride and Chuck Hines, who were my first two teachers, and I was just taking like elective classes. But after that, I mean, they were wonderful. But then eventually, I transferred to Alfred because that's just what I did. And my first instructors were Val Cushing, John and Andrew Gill, Wayne Higbee, and Doug Jeck. And then it was this period where there was a lot of changeover, where Val retired, Doug left to get another teaching job, and then Linda Sikora and Walter McConnell came in to teach those classes. So I feel really fortunate, actually. I was able to bridge that transition between like the folks that had been there for a while and then the newer faculty. And then when I came back as a grad student, like Linda and Walter had been there for quite a while. Ann Courier was also a huge influence for me. So there were just some really wonderful people that I feel lucky to have interacted with and developed relationships with.
Yeah, that's quite a roster. So the next question is by Anshel Anand. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. And this person is saying that they really loved your exhibition at the Renwick and saw many of your broken quote pots. And they're asking if you control the breaking or is it more laissez-faire? And they thank you for the wonderful talk. Yeah, so, how much do you plan that, I guess? And I was wondering the same thing.
Well, I think like the goal is to go in without a plan, but then I think over time it's like I've seen enough to have some sense of what might happen, but I'm always like really hoping that there's something different, that presents itself. So, I think the breaking's controlled to a point, it's like I kind of know where there's tension in a form, like in a certain kind of form, which might be different than another kind. So if I'm creating an opening, it might be in one place versus another. But honestly, like in the kiln, like it just, like if I have to do commissions through my gallery, like the first thing is always, you can't expect anything. Like you just said, we have no idea what's going to happen. So you're just sort of trusting that it's going to like, follow the same line of thinking around these collapsed vessels, but it's not going to look like how you imagine it in your head. Which is frankly the part that is the most exciting for me. It's what kind of keeps me coming back to it.
Yeah, there's so much to talk about with that. I love they're sort of like anti-capitalist in a way. I don't know, but I'll go to the next question, which actually dovetails nicely as well. How do you know when to call a piece finished? You talked about your grad school work, like you just had a date, but Benjamin, this question is from Benjamin Delata, and they're also asking, along with how do you know when a piece is finished, what makes it successful?
It's a good question. I think it's somewhat like intuition at times. Like that one piece I showed that was the largest vase I'd made, or jar that I'd made, that collapsed. I'd probably put that on a shelf for like 2 years before I came back to it, because I couldn't quite wrap my head around it, and also just time, but I knew that there's something really interesting that happened in that moment. So I didn't want to discard it. And I actually keep a lot of things that maybe seem so far beyond my expectation that I don't know what to do with it. And then I come back to it later. But, that's part of it, is just like a feeling for me, where it might look right aesthetically, or it starts to conceptually kind of come together in a way, or I can find a solution for that. So there's no like simple answer to that for me, but that's about the best I can provide.
Yeah. So Kellen Grissom is asking if you find any inspiration from Ai Weiwei and his Broken Pot series.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's an incredible, not just artist, but like kind of social like phenomenon, and like warrior for the people, like in the kind of human rights that he's been fighting for. And, and I certainly think like a lot of the art objects that he makes are, they're incredible. I mean, they're incredibly inspired and very, like very thoughtful in the intention with material and, the modules sometimes that he's sort of putting together. So yeah, I mean, I'm definitely a fan, and I luckily had a chance to see a number of kind of major exhibitions of his in person.
There's a lot of questions, so I'm just keeping them going. And actually this next one is from Rhiannon Ouellette, who is a ceramics major, and Rhiannon actually has the same question that I do, one of mine. And she's asking, she says she sees human forms in so many of the vases, and is that intentional? Actually, maybe this is from John Robinson. I'm confused about who's asking, but yeah, are they figurative on purpose, or are they just kind of like ending up that way? Because I totally see like, oh, like sad hunched over figures, or I don't know.
Well, I think that honestly, the vases, the forms themselves that I'm appropriating are rooted in human kind of proportion, and like if you sort of look at like the golden mean and like the way that like aesthetics are sort of developed over time, it's like they do follow a lot of those same kind of structures, so that when, like for me, it's like if I'm recreating a baluster vase, for example, it has similar proportions, and then it's a collapse of that. So then it almost like, I think that's where a lot of the like emotional connections certain people have to it are, because it's not upright, it's something that feels like there's some other emotion that's attached to it, that's not happy. So I wouldn't say that I'm applying that to it, but I think that that is certainly a part of the nature of the work.
So the next question, and I'm not sure, Bob, like how long we want to go. There's a few more, but so
Probably one or two more questions, Stephanie. Yeah.
One or two more questions. Okay. So, okay. Yeah. So one more from Rhiannon on, let's see. Sorry. No, this is from another ceramics student, Carly. Do you consider, this is interesting, your Tony the Tiger work a form of portraiture? Like how do you, and I guess maybe more, like a little bit more on Tony, like how do you see that representation?
That's interesting. I've never been asked that before. Good question. I guess I wouldn't, I'm not necessarily trying to represent Tony with any sort of interpretation or expression. Like I feel like it's more of appropriation for me, of that image and then recontextualizing it, but I'm not like trying to make him look more heroic or less heroic or more accessible. It's really like just like the sort of content in that imagery and what that imagery represents, to me or to others, like in a different period of time.
Yeah, it's sort of turning it inside out in a way. So we'll end on this question. I'm going to combine Kim Tan, who just recently graduated in ceramics. I'm going to combine her question with mine, another one for me. So Kim is asking how you balance being a father, director, artist, person, etc. You wear many hats. You didn't talk a whole lot about your role at the Bray, but she's asking about balance. And my question is related in regard to, do you think about legacy? And it's kind of a big one, but like, because I think it's related to that. Like you have this major role as an artist and major role in this like historic institution. So I don't know, those two ideas, balance and legacy. How do you think about those?
Those are big things.
Sorry, no pressure.
Yeah, I mean, balance, I think it's like, it's probably changed over time. I feel really fortunate to be in a place where I get to sell work. I get to like show in these spaces, like if you'd asked me when I was a grad student, like what the dream was, is that the fact that anybody's interested is like amazing, so I try to be aware of that, because I think for students in particular, right, like everything's ahead of you and you're thinking about like, what's the ideal, for a career, like what do you want to do? And I mean, the only advice I'd give is like, I feel like I've tried to stay pretty true to myself and my own voice, not trying to make work for other people. And frankly, the Bray's giving me that opportunity because, I have this job and I also have all these resources available to me and other people, that allowed me to take my work and evolve it in a way at a rate that I think was necessary, and it was slower, but I also didn't have as much time to make work because I had to do all this other stuff as a director of the Bray. So I think that they kind of like balanced each other in a way. And I don't know, I mean, I think like ultimately as a student, I used to think this, like I would sometimes look at people's work on the internet and I'd be like, God, I love like Sunguyo's work. I wish I could make it. I wish I'd made his work, or like just certain people like Betty Woodman, her work is so great. And in the end, it's like your work is only going to come out of who you are and how honest you are with yourself and the things that you think are important and the ideas that you want to sort of contend with, and there's no competition, right? It's like, it's just you and unlocking that. So I feel like in terms of legacy and all that stuff, like, I don't know if I really think about that. Like, of course I think about, everybody thinks about it on some level, but I don't know how important it is. You know, I think that like I just want to have a happy life. I love my family. You know, I make things that I want to make for a living, which is kind of insane, you know, that I like have that ability to like make a giant wall of plates with Tony the Tiger on it, and that's okay, you know. like I feel really, I think that's good to just feel lucky about that kind of stuff. So I also feel like, you know, pursue things that like it's important to pursue things that maybe you just don't fit, you know. Like for me, the making all that puncheon work like during the pandemic was like really important, you know, whether or not it becomes a core part of my work moving forward. It was just important for me to like go there and feel some freedom to do that.
Well, thank you so much, Steve. That was just super fantastic. So it's great to see you. Good luck with everything up in Helena. And I'll leave it to Bob, Nancy, and Matt if you guys have any closing comments.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. I'm just going to say thanks everyone for attending. Don't forget that we have 2 more lectures scheduled at the end of October and then again in the spring and April. Keep checking your emails as information about those comes out, and Nancy and Matt.
Yeah. I just wanted to thank our guest, fabulous lecture. And also, I meant to say at the beginning that October 25th, Auerbach Lecture is a Nigerian artist, MacArthur Fellow, and Jadeka Akonili Crosby. And I practiced that before and then totally forgot. So please join us on the 25th of October for another guest artist. And thank you so much for being with us.
Yes. Thank you, Steve. It was fantastic. And looking forward to seeing you on Thursday.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you again. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.